The name for this series was inspired by a column written by Drew Pearson, the leading Washington columnist of his day. He wrote a column that was critical of General Donovan and the OSS. And in his column, he said that so many OSS personnel were members of the social register that its initials really stood for oh so social. But here's the denouement of the story. Because Pearson owned a farm not far from Congressional Country Club in Bethesda, Maryland, which served as an OSS training facility during the war. As you might expect, General Donovan didn't take kindly to this slight from Drew Pearson. And so after his column was published, General Donovan sent a group of OSS commandos who were training at Congressional to raid Pearson's farm for practice. And I hope General Donovan would I'm sure he would appreciate the kind of tongue-in-cheek reference that we're using today by naming the conversation series after that infamous incident. We're honored to bring you leaders from the intelligence and special operations communities to discuss critical national security issues. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have the Honorable Michael Vickers, former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and General David Petraeus, who served as the former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, lead us in this discussion. The focus of tonight's discussion is General Petraeus' new book, Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Admiral McCraven wrote that not since Clausewitz is on War has the book provided so much insight into the nature of warfare, deeply researched, brilliantly constructed, and thoroughly entertaining. Conflict gets to the heart of why some nations win and other nations lose wars. It is a book that will shape the thinking of policymakers and military strategists for generations to come. And we provided a link to General Petraeus' book in the chat if you'd like to purchase a copy of it. Feel free to submit questions through the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And when you do, please include your affiliation. At the end, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. I'd like to thank our series sponsors, BCG, FedEx, General Atomics, and IQT, and our series patrons, Mark Siegel, Ivan Schlager, Chinye Hostler, Hardwick Simmons, and Sloan Taylor Miller Simmons, Paul Halal, Marion Cameron Gray, and Joel Marcus. And to the hundreds of people who are with us this evening, thank you for supporting the OSS Society. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Vickers. Dr. Vickers' career as a special operator, a CIA operations officer, a national security policymaker, and an intelligence community leader has spanned the last two decades of the Cold War through a decade and a half of our war with Al-Qaeda, its allies and offshoots, service that saw unprecedented senior tenure across both Democratic and Republican administrations. Most recently, Dr. Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, exercising authority, direction, and control over the NSA, the DIA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Security Service, and the intelligence components of the military service and combatant commands. He's received the highest awards our nation can give in the fields of intelligence and defense. His memoir was published last year by All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. And we're also going to include a link to that book in the chat if you'd like to purchase a copy of it too. Dr. Vickers certainly would have met the criteria for what was described as an ideal OSS candidate, a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight. But due to the virtual nature of tonight's event, I'm fairly confident there won't be any bar fights. So it's my honor now to please welcome Dr. Mike Vickers.
Well, thank you, Charles, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our OSO Social. This evening, we have the great privilege of hearing from General David Petraeus. He's a graduate of West Point, having served 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of them in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, command of the United States Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. And then following his retirement from the military, he served as director of CIA. General Petraeus is the only person in Army history to be the top graduate of both the demanding Ranger School and the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. And to top that, he's got a PhD from Princeton, so we ought to be able to ask him a wide range of questions tonight. He's an honorary chair of the OSS Society and a recipient of its William J. Donovan Award. It's a true honor to have him here. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for the vote. It's always a privilege to do something for the OSS Society, especially Frank National Museum of Intelligence, operating from a club in New York City, and great to be with the OSS Society.
Well, thank you for being with us. So you cover a lot of ground in your book, from the Chinese Civil War to Mao's takeover of China to Ukraine. And you even cover some very obscure cases like the Dhofar Rebellion in Oman in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if you knew this, when I was a Special Forces soldier, I was sent for counterterrorism training with the British Special Air Service, and a lot of my SAS instructors were veterans of Dhofar, and I had to look it up and figure out what it was about. So I really appreciated your book. And then, later as a CIA officer on the ground in the invasion of Grenada, and then as the Afghanistan Covert Action Program officer, I really enjoyed your reading, your assessment about these two conflicts. So let's begin with the major takeaways from your book. And I know, strategic leadership is really at the center of this. What do you want our readers and listeners to really learn from the book most of all, besides a great history lesson?
Well, about the importance of strategic leadership, the critical component really that determines success or failure of a conflict is how well, in particular, the theater commander does. Yes, there's strategic leadership that's exercised by, at the very top, the commander-in-chief, President of the United States, UK Prime Minister, others the Sultan of Oman in the Great Dhofar Rebellion case, which is a delightful one because it was such a textbook case of a really thoughtful leader together with a great British brigadier pulling it all together and conducting an actually textbook case. And by the way, then the British, for the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he was of all things the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander. And I took into him a copy of his book, which was modestly titled "We Won a War," and asked him to inscribe it for me. But look, the tasks of a strategic leader are the same for all leaders at any level. The difference being that if the strategic leader doesn't perform the first task competently, superbly, then there's a very slim chance that that side is going to prevail. That first task is to get the big ideas right. It is to understand the strategic context, your forces, the enemy forces, the physical terrain, the human terrain, the neighborhood, all the elements of society, the tribes, the ethnic groups, the sectarian groupings, the political parties, business, you name it, all of it, the host nation forces, and how the country's supposed to run, how it really runs, all of this, and then craft the right strategy, the right big ideas. This seems obvious. It seems it should be easy. Everybody has, they've all gone to staff colleges, war colleges, and all the rest of that. And yet, it took us 13 years to get the big ideas right in Vietnam. Multiple US commanders failed to grasp the reality that that needed to be a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign instead of a war of attrition employing search and destroy tactics, big unit war thrashing around the jungle with ephemeral achievements that could never be won. We could not win a war of attrition against the North Vietnamese and the cadre, the Viet Cong that they were able to establish in the South unless we changed our approach. And unfortunately, it was too late at that point in time. But there are many examples of this that we go through in the book. So number one, you've got to get the big ideas right. Then the strategic leader has to communicate them effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization to all other stakeholders, anyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. So that's not just your own forces and the coalition and host nation and partners and all that. It's also America's mothers and fathers. It's the president, it's the prime minister, it's the host nation leader, et cetera. And then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, the third task. That's what we normally think of as leadership. That's the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting the best and brightest, hanging on to them as long as you can, developing them. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture you design for that conflict. They're all different, and you have to get the right one, again, to implement the big ideas, to implement the strategy. It's how the leader spends his or her time. Your battle with them is crucial. The way you drive the implementation of a campaign plan, such as that during the surge in Iraq or in Afghanistan, is the meetings you conduct and the frequency. That's how you monitor it. And then it's the metrics, and they have to be very rigorous to help you understand whether you are actually winning or losing, whether you're making progress or experiencing setbacks. And then there's a fourth task, which is enabled by, sometimes forced by, some of the meetings you have and the activities, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas so that you can do it again and again and again. Look, I've been in the civilian sector for 10.5 years now, partner in one of the world's largest investment firms, chair our global institute, geopolitical risk, et cetera. This applies there very much as well. We own 120 companies and have minority interests in another 100. This, you can see whether the strategic leader of those companies is getting the big ideas right or not. And that's what determines success or failure, just as it does on a battlefield. So in the introduction, we lay out this intellectual construct for strategic leadership, which I distilled and used as a 3-star. Between my only non-combat command was one 3-star assignment back in the States, during which we also did the counterinsurgency field manual, which provided the big ideas for the surge in Iraq. But I used this model explicitly, did it as well at CENTCOM, Afghanistan, CIA, and subsequently. And if those that really want to get into it, there is a website at the Belfer Center at Harvard, belfercenter.org. If you search for Petraeus on strategic leadership, there was a team there when I was a fellow at Harvard, all of whom had worked for me in the war zones. They were graduate students who helped distill this and lay it out in a lot more detail about how you go about doing each of these tasks and a variety of other subjects that are related to it. So that's the big takeaway. Again, it's in the introduction, we lay it out, and then we evaluate the quality of the strategic leadership in each of these conflicts that we cover. And for example, the French in Indochina, Dien Bien Phu was a seriously bad big idea. You know, the French were frustrated, the guerrillas, the Viet Minh, the Chinese, the communist Vietnamese wouldn't join them in battle the way they wanted to. So they created this huge base well out into the countryside, surrounded by hills. They said, oh, they'll never get artillery up on those hills. Don't worry about air cover. Yeah, it's at the edge of that, but you know, they're going to finally come to battle and we're going to defeat them. Didn't quite work out that way. So again, you've got to get the big ideas right. Just one final comment on that. When it came to Afghanistan, we didn't get the inputs right. This is not just the big ideas now, it's also the level of forces and also spies, development workers, diplomats, rule of law experts, financial forensic, all of this, the right leaders, the right organizational architecture, and all the other inputs right for 9 years after we had that brilliant campaign of soldiers on horseback, special forces on horseback, and CIA officers with trunks full of cash that toppled the Taliban and did eliminate the al-Qaeda sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned in eastern Afghanistan. But of course, Osama bin Laden did get away. We caught up with him 10 years later. In fact, when I happened to be the commander, and I think you were the undersecretary for intelligence, it was an exciting evening.
Yeah. So you mentioned about it took us too long to get the big ideas right in Vietnam. And as I recall, you wrote your PhD dissertation on the lessons the U.S. should take away from it.
Yep.
Did writing this book cause you to reassess your views at all after these years, or?
It did, in part. Keep in mind, I wrote the dissertation at the 10-year mark, so it's the mid-1980s. You didn't have all the release of documents, the declassification, the additional scholarship, analysis, memoirs, all of that.
Yeah.
And also my focus for the dissertation, I was trying to develop intellectual capital I might draw on down the road. So it was about military influence and the use of force in the post-Vietnam era. In other words, how did Vietnam affect the advice and so forth that the senior military gave, and actually proved to be very valuable because, you know, a couple of decades later, I was the guy giving advice on the use of force, not one, but 2 wars. And this provided some intellectual big ideas about how I should shape the advice that I got, what are the factors that matter, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a different look at much more at the efficacy the appropriateness of that strategy. And we quote Clausewitz in the beginning of that chapter, that famous phrase where he says the first and most important task of a military commander is to determine the nature of the campaign in which he is embarked, not trying to make it into what he'd like it, but actually dealing with it as it is. And that's a pretty important piece of reflection there. And by the way, incredibly grateful to my longtime shipmate, Admiral Bill McRaven, the guy who got bin Laden that night, if you will, commanded the special ops element that did that, for his incredible blurb about not since Clausewitz has there been such an impactful book or something.
Yeah, you're in good company. Yeah, and Pericles, in Thucydides, in the funeral oration, makes the similar point about know which war you're embarked upon before you get into it.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So then turning to the present day, you mentioned Afghanistan. Let me ask you a tough question. I have my own views, but was our complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, which directly led to the Taliban's takeover, a strategic mistake?
Yes, it was a huge mistake. It was a seriously big idea.
Yeah.
The question was, could we have sustained what we were doing? And in the big ideas and sustainment, it comes down to the cost in blood and treasure. We had not lost a soldier in 18 months, and that's not because of the agreement we reached with the Taliban. It was because we were in the advise, assist, and enable business, no longer the frontline fighting business. And so that was sustainable. And then the cost, 25 billion, you remember when it was 100 billion a year and more just for the military.
Right.
That was very sustainable in a defense budget of 850 million. And my view, I said publicly at the time, when the Biden administration said that they would continue, they would honor the agreement, but just stretch it out a bit. I said, I believe we will come to regret this decision. And I hope that we have, because I think the outcome has not just been tragic and heartbreaking. I think it's been disastrous. The Taliban reneged immediately on one of their major commitments, which is that they would not allow extremists to have sanctuary in their soil. And of course, as is publicly known, our old organization tracked down the head of that, Al-Qaeda, 3 blocks from the palace and in a house controlled by the Taliban. So, but more important than that, frankly, is the lot in life of the Afghan people, 50% of whom can't even go to high school, much less college, can't do anything meaningful outside the house without a male escort. The economy is completely collapsed. There's enormous food insecurity. Half the population is malnourished. And then there are those that we left behind. Congress created a special immigrant visa specifically for the battlefield interpreters who shared risk and hardship with our soldiers on the ground, multiple tourist equivalent, and their families. And we left behind about 150,000 of them. So we have to think about the impact of that the next time we're in a situation where we're trying to recruit host nation support. And that doesn't include the special operators and the others that really were doing a lot of work with us. There is one organization that is publicly known that did get all of their host nation elements out, tens of thousands, and that is the one that we were privileged to serve in.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, as someone who spent 30 years off and on involved in that place, it's just heartbreaking as well as strategically stupid, as you said. So you write very eloquently and persuasively about the Iraq War between 2003 and 2011. And of course, you were the central figure in turning that war around. And then you trace the path of withdrawal of U.S. forces from 2011 to the invasion of ISIS in 2014 from Syria. And you and I were together, at least for a couple of those years. What, if anything, and I remember conversations we had and proposals we made, what, if anything, should we have done differently to prevent ISIS's return, or could have done differently?
Well, the truth is that the majority of the blame falls not on the administration at that time. It falls on Prime Minister Maliki.
Yep.
Within 24 hours of the departure of our final combat forces, noting that we still left a 3-star and a train and equip mission, but they were not combat forces. Within 24 hours of then General Austin departing, he pursued highly sectarian actions that tore the fabric of society that would fought so hard and sacrificed so much to put back together, starting with the surge, and then sustained it for a good 3.5 years. And he wasn't a bad partner in all of that, frankly.
Right.
But he immediately went after the senior Sunni political leader in the country, the vice president of the country.
Yep. Yep.
And then there's his security detail, Tariq al-Hashimi.
Yeah.
That enraged the Sunni population, which again would spent 4.5 years trying to get back into the fabric of society. He then went after the Minister of Finance, the next ranking guy, someone we'd signed saying there was no blood on his hand because there was a question about his role in the Fallujah hospital earlier. Then he went after a prominent parliamentarian from Anbar, a Sunni stronghold. And this so enraged the Sunni population that they started demonstrating on a mass scale. Iraqi security forces, with commanders put back in charge by Maliki that I'd insisted be fired, General Mehdi and others among them, were very abusive in responding to this. But in the course of that, so that inflamed it further, they took their eye off the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which by then was called the Islamic State. And a huge lesson here, and it's applicable to all these groups and to Hamas, I will add as well. If you take your eye off an extremist group, it will reconstitute. And that's what happened. It drifted into Syria, gained additional combat power, experience, leaders, explosives, vehicles, weapons, money, and everything else, and eventually established the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate. We then had to go back in to help them, to provide advice, assistance, and to enable them to defeat that, to destroy the caliphate, eliminate it. So it really has to do with Maliki, but the truth is we should have kept forces there. The problem was that we created too high a bar for that. In some testimony, it was said that we would need a parliamentary status of forces agreement. That was not going to be forthcoming. Maliki said he would sign it himself, and we could have kept, say, 5 or more thousand, and that would have enabled the infrastructure, at least, to still be there. Because you'll recall how hard it was to rebuild all of that, having evacuated all of it, to then help them first withstand the Islamic State as it threatened the very gates of Baghdad, and then to help them go on the offensive and eliminate it. So there were some other issues. Maliki also, there were ways that we could have kept capabilities that were needed to keep an eye. I was, of course, at the agency by then. There were ways that we could have done this without getting into the details. Maliki agreed to it.
Right, I remember.
I pitched the idea with Hillary Clinton, and President already approved it.
Yeah.
He agreed to it, which was great. So now we're going to keep all these capabilities and assets and people necessary to help their counterterrorism service, which is an entire separate department there, really. It reports not to the Ministry of Defense. And it's really quite capable. Unfortunately, he never signed the document that we need. He kept stringing us along. I should just note as a final little footnote in history, I showed up within 48 hours of our final forces departure. It was mid to late December. I was going to see the station members before Christmas. All hell had broken loose. There were tanks pointed at the Sunni gathering location, and I ended up shuttling around the entire night, just trying to keep them from creating a real conflict, starting a shooting war. It was just like the first weeks of the surge, when they were all fighting with each other again. I thought, my gosh, deja vu, here we are.
Right.
But that's how that came about. So again, it's really on Prime Minister Maliki, not the administration, but I thought the administration should have more enthusiasm to keep forces than it did.
So let's now turn to more current wars in Ukraine. So, your chapter on the book covers the Russian invasion and occupation, but concludes at the 1 year point.
Yep.
The war's now entering its 3rd year. So what's your assessment of the current state of the war and how you see it evolving this year and next?
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is that the future of the war, the only way you can answer this question is the way I answered every question when I was an economics professor in an earlier life, by starting with, it depends. That's the only way to answer it. And right now, it depends very, very much on whether U.S. support will continue. I was just at the Munich Security Conference. I heard President Zelensky. I met with his national security advisor, met with some frontline forces that were brought to Munich for that purpose, a number of others, and European leaders, NATO Secretary General, and others. This really hinges a lot, because even though the Europeans have provided $2 for every dollar we've provided, and now just another 50 billion from the EU itself, the problem is that we are the only country with a really industrial strength capacity to fill up their supply lines with 155 millimeter howitzer rounds, the air defense interceptors, which are crucial. You know, Kyiv, I've been there twice in the last 9 months. It's, you know, I never even went into the air raid shelters. They're going off all the time, but they're knocking everything down. So life is generally somewhat normal. Yes, there's debris that falls. Yes, occasionally there's someone injured or killed. But by and large, if you lose that, they're in real trouble. It's also, we're the country that can provide a number of the other capabilities that they really desperately need. The longer range, I hope we will finally agree to provide the Army Tactical Missile System as well, and some others. I generally think, by the way, that the U.S. Response to this was quite impressive, but that subsequently a number of the decisions that we made took far too long and were delayed. And among the reasons why the counteroffensive last summer didn't work was that we waited too long to approve tanks, which was the key to get the Germans to provide tanks, Western aircraft, longer range precision munitions, a whole series, categories of weapon systems that they should have had. And still, it might not have been enough, because our doctrine says you have to have air superiority. Right. They weren't going to achieve that. Neither side has that, actually, given the capabilities of the air defenses on both sides. But it depends. So that's first and foremost. But second, the Ukrainians have to come to grips with how they're going to generate forces. They have a system that results in the average age of a frontline soldier being over 40 in comparison to, the, say, the 18 to 23-year-old average of our soldiers in the wars I was privileged to command. And they have legal issues. Their legal structure on how they recruit doesn't start till 27, conscription. They have to lower that. And then there are a variety of other mechanisms they have to take. This is very politically difficult for President Zelensky. And being there at Munich, watching him speak, seeing him, there's one question he actually will not answer in full, and that is, how are you going to remedy your force generation issues? You know, the mood in Ukraine is one of, there's a weariness. It's different. It's sober. There's worries, especially. I mean, frontline soldiers are actually Googling to see the U.S. House of Representatives action on the Senate-approved support package that also has, of course, funding for Israel and for the Indo-Pacific. It also depends, though, on the technology race. Both sides are racing ahead in this regard. The Russians are finally learning, unfortunately, after a first year that was really pretty disastrous for them. The Ukrainians have a very impressive military industrial complex. It's their maritime drones that forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet largely to withdraw from the important occupied Crimea port of Sevastopol. And they've destroyed about a third of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which can't be replaced because the Montreux Convention prevents warships from transiting the Bosphorus during a time of war. So they've now been able to export grain through the Western Black Sea to these countries that are very heavily dependent on this. It's 25% of the world's grain exports, including Egypt and others in the Sahel. So again, there's then a number of other factors, further aid from Europe, Russia's ability to continue to generate forces. You know, at what point do Russia's mothers and fathers and wives say, not my son, not my husband, as they see the caskets come back? Noting that, of course, if you're talking about somewhere around 85,000 killed as the upward bounds of this for Russia in 2 years, that is many times the roughly 15,000 that you and your comrades helped inflict on them in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. You know, is there a limit to which Russia can't go beyond when it comes to this issue? noting that they've never fully mobilized. They're on a wartime footing with their economy, but they're shielding the elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the other locations like that from the brunt of this war. So again, it's all of these different factors. And a final one would be the success of further sanctions and export controls, tightening the sanctions evasion, policing that, and then also could there be a mechanism by which the $300 billion of Russian funding in Western banks, a lot of it in Europe, could be given to Ukraine, seized and given to Ukraine. Right now, they're going to take the interest on it, which is billions in and of itself, and give it to them. But that would be a real breakthrough if they could be rebuilding at a much more rapid rate than they are right now. Over.
So I agree with you 100% on the operational assessment and some of the strategic issues for Ukraine. If you could talk to Speaker Johnson right now, what would you tell him about how important to the U.S. Russia's defeat in Ukraine is?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, they are fighting our war. This is in our national security interest. This is not charity at all. This is cold, hard calculation. Henry Kissinger said before he died, NATO security now begins at the Ukraine-Russia border. So we have an enormous stake in this outcome. Second, of course, is if Putin were ever able to succeed, he doesn't stop in Russia. We've heard his speeches, and he actually follows through on these grievance-filled, revanchist and revisionist views of history that he has. He'll continue. Moldova would be next. In fact, today there's news that the people of Transnistria, this is this little sliver of land in eastern Moldova, where there's still 1,500 Russian troops left over from the Cold War, very economically depressed region. They're asking for protection from Russia. You know where that leads. Now, Russia doesn't have a lot of extra forces to give them, but you can see where this, we've seen this movie before. Lithuania would be in the crosshairs. They were mentioned, I think, 42 times in that one speech that he gave, that long speech, that essentially was the intellectual foundation for the invasion of Ukraine. This is somebody who, you'll recall, he was asked what was the worst geopolitical event of the 20th century. Yeah. And, a century that had 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Right. And he said the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Well, it tells you what he's trying to do. Yeah. Reassemble the Russian Empire, be the czar. So that's really important. There's another issue here, too. In the book, we repeatedly note that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in other parts. Yeah. And if you're concerned about deterrence with China in particular, noting that the big ideas on deterrence are it rests on the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other, you don't want there to be any doubt in a potential adversary's mind that you have the will to do this. And so if you have a red line that's not a red line, that reverberates out in Southeast East Asia. If you withdraw from Afghanistan when there's no real imperative to do that, yes, it's a long war, but we've kept tens of thousands of troops in other countries. Yeah, they're not at war, but again, it was sustainable. However maddening, frustrating, and feckless that our partners were, and all the rest. But that's another reason, and that's where I don't buy the arguments of those that say this is distracting us from the main effort, which should be in the Indo-Pacific. Not at all. It is central to the main effort, because what we're trying to do in the Indo-Pacific is deter. And a key component of that is keep in mind that when we pulled out of Afghanistan, President Xi seized on this. He told his neighbors, especially the first island chain, see, you can't count on the Americans. They're an unreliable ally and partner. And look how it went. They're a great power in decline. I don't believe either of those, but we sure gave him some ground, some ammunition. I would also contend that that was one factor, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that led Putin, of many factors, to think that he could invade Ukraine and get away with it much more than he has.
Right. So let's now turn to the Middle East and Israel-Hamas war. How do you assess the current state of that war's trajectory and end state, which right now seems far?
Sure. Well, Israel has determined that they need to destroy Hamas I agree with that. Destruction, by the way, that doesn't mean every single individual, doesn't mean they all have to be killed or captured. It means you have to render them incapable of accomplishing their mission without reconstitution. Again, keep in mind, you got to keep them at the end of this from reconstituting. That's very, very challenging. And dismantle the political wing. Yep, you can't have them ever oversee Gaza again. By the way, again, Hamas is an Islamist extremist terrorist group. It's akin to the Islamic State, much more than, say, some political ideological insurgency or something where you could reconcile with many more of them than you can here. So that is the determination, and they have largely destroyed Hamas in northern Gaza. Although there's a problem, you can see Hamas trying to reconstitute. And what that means is there needs to be much greater emphasis on the hold phase of this, not just clear and move on, but you have to clear, hold, and build, which implies you have to have a counterinsurgency campaign mindset, much more than a conventional military mindset. And also you're fighting among the people in any event. Hearts and minds matter. Absolutely have to keep civilian loss of life to an absolute minimum, destruction to the extent that you can, noting that this is the most fiendishly difficult context, certainly since the end of World War II in urban fighting. We did a lot of these major battles during the surge in Iraq: Ramadi, Fallujah, Baquba, cities of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, Mosul, nearly 2 million, parts of Baghdad. We used a counterinsurgency mindset, though, of clearing and holding. You literally wall the areas off once you clear them. You have biometric ID cards to get in and out of there. You have to retain them to separate the extremists from the people. So I think there has to be a greater emphasis on that, and really a slightly different campaign mindset in that regard. And there should be explicit commitments to the people, as we would give to the people of Ramadi, of Fallujah, and so forth, that your life is going to be better when Hamas is out of it. Now, keep in mind, the trauma that Israel has sustained, this is the worst event of their history. It's the most significant intelligence and military readiness failure in their history. They lost the equivalent, in our terms, of 42,000 civilians and some military, had 7,000 equivalent taken hostage. Keep in mind that we lost not quite 3,000 on the 9/11 attacks, and we do need to appreciate that. But again, there's another issue, and that is we always had a sign on the wall of our command post staring at me in the 5 combat commands, and it asked the question: will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, you have to retool it. If it still can't get to yes, you really have to think long and hard about that. Because again, you're not going to win hearts and minds, given the affinity for Hamas in the population, but you don't want to sow the seeds of Hamas 2.0 by the campaign in which you are seeking to destroy Hamas 1.0. Then there's also going to have to be the day after plan in a lot more detail. In my view, it should include a commitment to 2 states for 2 people. The domestic politics of Israel won't allow that, certainly right now. But the sooner that can be established, that gives you then an objective to which you want to get, noting that, yes, they're probably going to have to administer Gaza for a period of time, but you need to commit to the Palestinians doing that over time. The problem there is, of course, there's no government in a box sitting in the West Bank on prepare to deploy orders with a capable, competent, and trustworthy government that can be brought over there to oversee this, much less to have the kind of security presence that can ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. So again, a really, really difficult situation, context, have made progress in the north, making progress in the center, a lot of tough work to do in the south, where of course you have well over 1 million displaced people alone around Rafah. And dealing with that, again, the sooner you can get them back into areas that are held, and rebuilt, and again, get the hospitals reopened, show the people that you're concerned about their welfare, et cetera, I think the better off this will be. but a lot of tough months, if not longer, of fighting lie ahead.
So let's now turn to future war a bit and this strategic competition with China and Russia, some call the new Cold War. You know, one of the features of the Cold War was that it was fought largely indirect through proxies or irregular warfare in certain cases. And I think one of the great strengths of your book and tracing the evolution of warfare in that period is you deal with both the evolution of irregular warfare and conventional warfare. So how do you see that evolving on the irregular side, or short of large scale conventional conflict between great powers, essentially, short of that, over this strategic competition?
Well, I mean, irregular warfare has evolved enormously, in part because of the advent of unmanned systems, and it's going to continue to evolve in that regard. And so we can now do, with lots of drones, lots of precision munitions, lots of intelligence fusion, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, gathering, all this, we can do advise, assist, and enable approaches in support of host nation or local partners much, much more effectively than we could.
Yeah.
We saw hints of this in the Battle of Fallujah in March and April of 2007, when one brigade commander had more drones, literally all the way from towers with optics, blimps with optics, drones, small drones, big drones, F-16s, and then literally we're flying U-2s over this neighborhood of 2 million people. And you started to get a sense of what the future might hold, but it's vastly, you know, the proliferation since then is much, much greater. Now, that doesn't mean that you can see into buildings completely yet. That doesn't mean you can see into tunnels necessarily. There are some advances in these areas. But again, if it is in terrain that doesn't have very, very heavy vegetation and it's not underwater, you are finally able to operationalize the old adage from the Cold War that we used to recite endlessly, but could not actually carry out, couldn't operationalize. And that was, what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. Well, we couldn't see all that well. We didn't have, I mean, it couldn't see in the depth of the battlefield. That was the objective, but you couldn't do it that well. And if you did see it and the target was moving, it was very hard to have dynamic targeting and so forth. So therefore, you couldn't really make this reality. If you look in the Indo-Pacific theater now, and again, it's on the surface and on up, you can see everything. And we're about to see another huge leap forward with commercial imagery at much, much greater resolution than ever before. This is approved by the previous administration, and it's a real leap ahead. And finally, we're seeing those capabilities go into space, and we'll start to see the advent of this. So we have to transition in conventional war from a world, very simplistically, of a small number of very large platforms, very heavily manned, incredibly expensive, and also exquisitely capable, but also vulnerable to a degree. Again, you can defend them, there's things you can do, but over time, this is going to be increasingly difficult. You have to transition from that to a massive number of much smaller unmanned systems, and not just in the air, but on the surface of the sea, subsea, even ground, space, even cyberspace, in which the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, in the form of actually designing what is this drone's mission, what are the instructions we're going to give it in the software, what are the conditions it has to meet to take a particular action. And it's going to be enabled by AI and machine learning as it's carrying this mission out. And you are going to have to turn it over to the machine, because if you keep the human in the loop, your machine's going to lose to the other machine. And there's obviously some real ethical concerns here, but we should note that air and ballistic missile defenses, at a certain point, the operator says weapons free, and that machine does what it's programmed to do. Not always successfully. I should note that before we launched the invasion of Iraq, when I was a division commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. There was a Patriot battery on each one of our major bases, if you will, out in the desert. And one that was on ours shot something down one night, and it turned out to be a British fighter, unfortunately.
Not good. Yeah. Yeah. You know, the phrase or mantra you mentioned about what can be seen can be hit and what can be hit can be killed, as you rightly point out in the book, kind of came from the study of the Yom Kippur War that
Exactly.
General
Yep.
Bill Depew, our former TRADOC commander,
Yes.
ordered. And I'm glad to see the military doing now an extensive study of Ukraine lessons learned, because this time we really mean it, you know. So
we took huge lessons from that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it really was, it was those lessons that led to the force structure
yeah.
and the capabilities, the big, in the Army, I think it was the big 5 or 6. It was the
Yeah.
M1 Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle,
Black Hawk, yeah, Patriot.
Black Hawk helicopter, the Apache, and the self-propelled 155, and probably some others.
Yeah.
But that's what, and I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army from 89 to 91, and watched this incredible machine first do the invasion of Panama, but then do, of course, the deployment to the Gulf and Operation Desert Storm. And it was the lessons from the Yom Kippur War in many respects that enabled us to make the decisions about the force structure and capabilities that we needed. And then even the doctrine and so forth that all enabled that.
So we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. So let me ask you a few more questions, and I'm weaving in some audience ones as well. So how likely do you think a war with China over Taiwan is, and are we preparing properly?
We are preparing. We are taking a number of actions. Think of the Indo-Pacific the initiative, where we are dispersing our forces, hardening our bases, improving their protection, going underground, all these actions, where we're transforming our forces, as I discussed. The problem is that it needs to be faster to be really certain of rock solid deterrence. Again, perception of our capabilities, you have to transform these capabilities and those of our allies and partners and help the Taiwanese and everything else. So we have a lot of agency here and we have to use it. The problem is, of course, as always, with any transformation, there are vested interests in what Senator McCain used to call the military-industrial congressional complex that in some cases enable, but in other cases actually delay some of the changes that should be made because you have to divest some proportion of our legacy systems to create the resources and the room to get the cutting edge systems. So that's what needs to happen. And then again, we need to be very conscious that what we do in one part of the world resonates out there and be careful not to undermine the assessment of our will. I think it's not an accident that President Biden on 4 occasions has said that we will come to the rescue of Taiwan. It's trying to shore up the perception of our will. Yes, then Jake Sullivan rushes out and says there's no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity and so forth and so on. But the point has been made.
So on the issue of deterrence and what happens in one theater matters in another, what's your thoughts about the risk of a global multi-theater war? You know, something that takes place in Europe with Russia and China, whether it's opportunistic aggression or planned.
Well, it's interesting because you really, I think, increasingly have to think about 4 countries that are all working together. North Korea is selling artillery rounds and we believe perhaps some missiles to Russia. Iran is selling drones and some missiles. China has this partnership with Russia. They have not really done. It's called a partnership without limits. It has actually had distinct limits. But again, you have to think about all of that. And then there's some other actors that could get in this mix as well. So that possibility is very real. What we need to do, of course, is always ensure that we're not directly involved in every one of these to the extent that it prevents us from doing what we need to do in the main effort location, which is, of course, the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if I could just very quickly sort of characterize the world that we are in now, and again, this is what I do for a living, but I believe that we face more challenges and threats and more complex challenges and threats than at any time since certainly the end of the Cold War, maybe World War II. So if you think of the US as the guy in the circus who has to keep a lot of plates spinning together with allies and partners, which we uniquely have, there are more plates in that tent, and they represent more complex challenges. The US and Western China relationship plate is the most important in there, more important than all the others. But there's still a North Korea plate. There's obviously a Russia plate. There's several Iran plates, nuclear program, missiles and drones, and then support to Shia militias and now support to Russia. There are cyber threat plates of all different types that are increasingly diabolically clever, unfortunately. There are Islamist extremist groups. Again, we have to keep an eye and pressure on them, ideally in support of host nations, advise, assist, and enable, don't do, wherever we can. And that's largely what we're doing in Iraq and Syria, Jordan, East Africa, West Africa to a degree, et cetera. There's even threats associated with, or challenges associated with, the advent of climate change and global warming, because you have much more severe weather events on a much more frequent basis. You have the desertification of the Sahel to a greater extent, which forces human migration, which creates problems for Europe, even really all the way into Latin America, and then trying to come to the US. So again, this overall context is far more challenging. And I believe the US has to continue to exercise leadership in this, because as we have seen when the US withdrew from Afghanistan and there were 3 times as many coalition forces as we had, they could not stay without us. So again, however you want to describe the indispensable nation or whatever, again, description, I think there's a lot to that. And I believe that it is in our interest to do this. This is not, again, charity. It's because we benefit from the rules-based international order, such as it is, with all of its shortcomings and so on.
No, I agree completely. So we've got time for about 2 more questions. I know
Okay.
you have to get to a dinner, so I'm going to weave in a couple of audience ones here with my own as well. So one current problem right now is that's been ongoing since 2014 is the recruiting challenge, and it's particularly acute in the Army right now, which has an authorized strength of 490,000 active and has, I think, 445 or something like that. And they just made, Secretary of the Army just made an announcement they're going to go down to 470, but that really means going up to 470.
Yep.
So one, how do we solve this problem, or
Yep.
what's the causes of it? And
Yep.
with advances in technology and AI, and to some extent substituting capital for labor, will that help address this down the road?
That may at some time, as AI really starts to replace people in addition to augmenting them. But let's keep in mind the paradox of unmanned systems, that the biggest challenge, as you'll recall, when I was trying to persuade Secretary Gates we need more Predators, the biggest challenge with unmanned systems was manning them. You needed about 150 people of all different skill sets and capabilities to keep one unblinking eye in place. That's usually multiple platforms, multiple pilots, payload operators, multiple armaments, maintenance, the radio, the communications architecture, the individuals that are actually taking the intelligence that these are gathering and processing it, interpreting it, both in terms of geospatial, but also languages, and then fusing all of it, putting it all together, and then actually producing finished intelligence products. Because without that, all you have is a soda straw in the sky. So I do think there will be gains over time, just as we see in the business world. You can replace call center with text messaging. The machine can understand it and answer to the first couple of questions, at least increasingly. But that's a real vexing issue. Now, the recruiting challenge, ironically, I think one reason that we are struggling to recruit is we're not at war. Now, I don't wish for a war to improve recruiting, but the wave of patriotism, a sense of a mission larger than self. I administered the oath of reenlistment in the biggest reenlistment ceremony in history, which was in Baghdad in the second year of the surge. 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines with their right hand in the air. And I'm wondering, why is this? Well, because it wasn't the stock options. This was about a mission larger than self, performing it with others who felt privileged to do that as well, in a sense that Americans supported and appreciated. Thank you for your service, even if we were implementing policies with which they disagreed. There's a number of other challenges, of course. One is a historically long period of historically low unemployment. So lots of options and competition out there. Harder to find those that qualify for service in terms of physical fitness, drug use in some cases, criminal records, education. Then the big is the propensity to serve. By the way, the physical fitness that the Army has solved, they say, you want to get in shape, we'll help you.
Yeah.
So you actually have pre-basic training courses now,
Yeah.
and we'll help you get in shape and lose weight and build muscle and all the rest of this stuff.
Right.
But it's going to take a lot of innovative ideas like that. It's also going to take more money. Again, this is a marketplace. I'm a firm believer in the professional force. I don't believe in a drafty force. I wouldn't want to try to attempt the complex operations we did that I was privileged to command with a force that's only around for 12 or 18 months. So again, we're going to have to compete more effectively. I think that I've heard the Army plans on this, old 4-stars, they give you all this stuff and everything. But I think they will make progress. I don't know whether they can truly close the gap, even with the reduced authorization between where they are right now. Interestingly, the Marines still have been able to recruit. There's something special about the few, the proud. They resonate with Americans and so forth. And again, other services have got to try to distill some of that to the extent that they can as well, noting that they're much, much larger, and that creates some challenges.
So let's talk for the last question about our newest service and smallest service, the Space Force. And, in your final chapter, you write very eloquently about AI and cyber and unmanned systems and disinformation and a lot of things that will shape future warfare. What are your thoughts on war in space, and then one other technology area, quantum computing, which certainly could potentially upend a lot of current day cryptography?
Absolutely. I mean, quantum, if it comes about, real quantum. And of course, theoretically, it is possible to get 0 Kelvin.
Yeah.
Practice has proved to be pretty elusive. There are near quantum systems. There are, you're edging, but you're not really at quantum. But if you get the quantum and it achieves what the theory says it could, it changes everything because you can now crack passwords with what used to take months of brute force very, very quickly because the accelerated computing power and so forth and all of that. That's going to be dramatic. And there are preparations for that. There are quantum proof. There's a lot of products out there actually in that world. Outer space is transforming all that we do. I mean, that's how you navigate. That's how you have timing, in the precision timing that actually enables frequency hopping, enables really precise strikes and all the rest of this. And if you blinded that, imagine, that was the reason for the concern about this Russian system that is either a nuclear powered system with an EMP weapon on it or a regular satellite. And we have nuclear powered satellites for some of our longer missions, or a satellite that's going to have a nuclear weapon in space that would be unbelievably destabilizing in a crisis. Because you're going to have to decide very quickly before you lose your eyes in the sky and your communications and your precision navigation and timing, etc. So
and wreck the global economy. But
exactly, How do you de-risk global economic collapse? So, but all of this, what you're really highlighting is how increasingly complex all of this is, and how challenging it is to pull it all together. I was just in India last week. The Indo-PACOM commander was there. I've had a long dialogue with him. about all the changes that he's making out there based on developing certain big ideas about, I won't not going into details, but who actually will do what in certain campaigns, what the organizational architecture looks like, how do they need to shore up the forces, how do they develop all this, how do you train for it, how do you integrate your allies? This stuff is really complex, and the challenge for those of the current generation is much greater than what we had when I was privileged to command in the war years, where we were focused pretty singularly on comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaigns. And as complex as they are, when you really focus on them, you can finally get it right and understand how to conduct those particular campaigns. This force has to be able to contend with that still. That's not gone away. We might do it in a different way, but then through normal conventional, but all the way on up. And now you've added 2 additional domains, outer space and cyberspace. And I would submit informational space, which is another huge challenge because of the proliferation of social media, the ubiquity of smartphones, internet access, the transparency that gives. This is really, really
and deep
hard government work.
Yeah. Well, we've had a wide-ranging conversation, and it's time to let you go. I
thank you.
And I can see it even in some of the dialogue we got. One listener quoted the Melian dialogue about, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they
submit.
Yeah, so I think we covered a wide range, and again, it's wonderful to see you again. And
likewise,
thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you, Dio Presso Liber. Thanks.
On behalf of the OSS Society and everybody who tuned in tonight, I want to thank Dr. Vickers and General Petraeus for leading this really enlightening, important, and fascinating discussion. I think the two of you could probably talk for hours on end, and we would be delighted to hear you do it, because it's always a privilege to hear you speak to one another about these important issues. And I also, of course, want to thank you both for your selfless service to our nation. And I want to thank everyone who attended tonight's conversation. We'll make this available on our website and through our social media. If you'd like to purchase a copy of either General Petraeus's or Dr. Vickers' book, if you go into the chat function and scroll to the top, you'll find a link to it. And I hope you'll all join us for our next OSO Social conversation, which will take place on April 3rd, 2024 at 6 p.m., when Dr. Vickers will interview the former commander of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, Lieutenant General Charles Cleveland, about his book, The American Way of a Regular War. So thank you again, and good night. We'll see you soon.